right. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. We're going to kick things off for real now. So really appreciate you being here. If you're just logging in, that's totally fine. I know it can take a minute or two to get everything started up. And yeah, just looking forward to working with you on Tableau Relationships today. If you haven't been through one of these webinars before, there's just a few like orders of business I want to talk about beforehand because I know these questions come up a lot. I'll be recording this, so it's something that you can look back on if you want to revisit any of the concepts, or if it's something you want to share with others or bookmark. I'll record it, and then I'll have a link of the recording out in the next couple of days so that you can access that and be able to come back to everything that we've talked about. And you are welcome to shoot questions over on the questions section or the chat throughout the webinar. I might be able to get to them while I'm presenting, but probably most likely I will be addressing some questions at the end, time allowing. So just thought I would start with that. And yeah, love seeing all the familiar names here, former students, folks that are following the blog, and I'm always happy to have new people as well. So thanks everybody that's here, maybe giving one number or giving me a chance for the first time. So let's go ahead and start talking about this thing, Tableau Relationships. It's a brand new feature that Tableau has just come out with, which is why we wanted to talk about it. It's only about a month into being on the shelf. Before we dive too deep into that though, I want to do a quick introduction of myself so that those folks who, if we haven't crossed paths before, you know at least a very small amount about who's presenting. So my name's Eric. I work with an organization called One Number. We're basically in Tableau's backyard, and we partner with them on all kinds of different work, teaching their classes for them, working on consulting projects, helping people get off the ground, doing some work with data preparation, sometimes with Tableau's tools, sometimes with other tools. So I've been teaching here in the Seattle area, the West Coast, the country, and even up into Canada sometimes for about 6 years now, and it's been a great experience, and I've learned a lot, and hopefully for those that have been in my classes, you've learned something too. So let's go ahead and start talking about these Tableau relationship things. So if you go to Tableau's website and you Google what are Tableau relationships, you're going to get a definition that looks something like this: an easy, flexible way to combine data from multiple tables for analysis. And if you read that, you might think, well, that sounds kind of similar to joins or to blending. So what exactly is this going to do for me that those other tools didn't? And at least that's the first question that came to my mind. So like, well, why should I care? And I would say that from the content that I've seen published so far, like other webinars, videos, blogs, they've done a great job of explaining how to use this new feature, but they haven't necessarily explained the situations where it's actually useful to use it. I'm a creature of habit. I'm guessing a lot of you are as well. And I'd rather just keep using what I'm familiar with, right? Okay, I'm just going to keep using joins until it makes sense to use something else. So I kind of thought back over the last 6 years of working in the Tableau world and thought about, what are a few situations where that would have been super useful if Tableau relationships had already existed, and that would have saved me a lot of headache or time or whatever it was. And I thought of 3 sort of key themes, I guess you could say, that I could see where Tableau relationships would have been helpful. So one of those would be reducing measure duplication when you are joining 2 tables that are different levels of granularity. We're going to look at examples of all of these. So I'm just touching them at the high level right now. Easily allowing you to filter across multiple data sources simultaneously, and then improving performance by only, I guess, including necessary dimensions when the tables are combined together. So rather than, hey, there's 100 columns in this table, and we're combining it with this other table of 100 columns, now you have 200 columns. And it's not necessarily going to, multiply all that data out to that level all the time. And again, we'll look at all that. So with this, actually the first thing I want to do before I dive into the first example is just show you a little bit about how this Tableau relationships interface works. So I'm going to use some Superstore data. If that's not something that you're very familiar with, the Tableau Superstore data, they use it for just all kinds of different examples and in the classes. So there's 3 main sheets in that Excel workbook. You have what's called orders. I don't remember the exact row. oh, I was wrong, 10,000 rows of data. Oh, this person bought pencils. This person bought a bookcase. And then the other table I'm going to be interested in right now is called people. So people is just a table that tells me who is the manager of different regions. All right. So in our sort of traditional join, I could join people to orders to figure out, oh, well, maybe whose region had the most sales. Right? So the way that you get to a join these days is once you pull the table in like orders, you hit the little drop down next to the box and you'll select open. And then once you've selected open, you can do normal types of joins and unions and things of that nature. So I can say, okay, here's orders. Let's join this to people. I'm going to join on this field region, and I'm off to the races. Okay. So joins are still going to be there. Don't worry. You don't have to worry about them going away. But what I do want to look at is, okay, what would this look like using the relationships feature? So I'm going to grab the people table and just drag this out to the right of orders. And notice this orange line that shows up. You might have heard people call this the Tableau noodle or something like that. So that's what they're talking about. And if I drop people in there and connect it via relationships to orders, it's similar to joins in the sense that I can create a relationship based on a single field or maybe even multiple fields. And there's a whole bunch of features we won't get into today because this isn't exactly meant to be a how-to session. I'll send some follow-up information of other people's how-to sessions. I think that'll be interesting. But what's interesting about this is if you select the two different tables, it will show you a preview of what's in them, but it won't show them combined together like a join would. Okay. And then just to show you what this looks like, if I go in here, now in my data pane, I just have a section called tables, and I'll see it's broken out into the orders table and the people table. So notice the sort of age-old dimension and measure breakup is no longer there. It is still there, kind of. It's just very subtle. It's just this gray line now distinguishing that everything above that gray line is a dimension, everything below that's a measure, and it actually does still show up when you drag fields around. So what I want to do is I want to use a field from people and show you how this works. So I'm going to grab this field person. Okay, if you remember, that people table was just 4 rows of data. So if I put person on rows, for instance, it shows me who are those 4 people. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put person on text, and I'm going to ask for the count aggregation. So what count does is it gives you a row count or the number of rows that have a valid value, like not a null. So this would tell me that the row count for my person table is 4. Right? It's kind of interesting. Whereas if I was to have used a field from orders, like category, and I put that on text, and then I ask for a count, I'm going to see that that is that nearly 10,000 figure, 9,994. So until I start using fields from both tables together, Tableau just treats them as different entities here. It's only once I start combining them, like maybe I say whose region had the most transactions. So I'll put person on rows, and then I could get a count of any field, I guess. I'll just ask for a count of category, that's fine. So I'll say, I'll just rewrite the question here. So whose region, the most transactions? So you can see, I'm able to see my 4 people, right? And then I'm able to see this row count that, if you look at the status bar, totals up to about 10,000. So in a lot of ways, this is actually working like a join. It's just a join that Tableau is just quickly creating on the fly. Okay, we got our people. We're going to connect that on that region field. We established that relationship earlier in the data source pane, and that's going to lead to us being able to see whose region had the most transactions. So that's just our 5-minute overview of how this relationships feature works. Again, I would love to get more into that, but that's not really meant to be the overarching theme of this webinar. So I'll send you more info about that. So let's start with our first of our 3 examples we're going to talk about, reducing measure duplication. So one of the first kind of large-scale Tableau projects I worked on was with a restaurant chain where it was a pretty complex project where we were looking at a variety of factors: how are sales doing, how many meals were comped, who's comping a lot of meals, is somebody just giving all these free meals to their friends, who's working the most overtime hours, are the managers staffing appropriately, there was a lot of questions being answered. But one of the big things that I remember, maybe because it was traumatic, was we needed to combine data from these two different tables that was called order headers and order details. So the way this worked is order headers had one row of data per transaction. So say, for instance, that you go to McDonald's for lunch and you get a burger and a drink and fries. I guess that would just be a meal, but just pretend you bought all three items separately for some reason. So in order headers, that would be represented as this one row of data. It'd be like, yep, you had, whatever, $8.50. But order details would break it out into three rows of data, one row for the burger, one row for the drink, one row for the fries. So that's a little bit about how they were different. And then the kind of information they had was different as well. So for instance, like order details might tell you the list price of an item. It might tell you a burger costs $2, but it wouldn't tell you the final charge, which would include tax and tip and things of that nature. So it was, for different reasons, sometimes we need data from order headers, sometimes from order details. Well, one of the issues that we started to run into was, let's say I use a join, like, so pre-relationships, we need to join these two tables together. Well, they're at different levels of granularity. So if I took order headers, which is 59 rows of data, and then I try to join that to order details. There's actually three fields I need to join on, so give me a moment here. Not list price. I need to join on receipt IDs, store, and date. All right. So doing this via join, order details has 148 rows, order headers has 59, so the join result's going to show 148 rows. Right? So then if I'm trying to answer this question of what was the final sales price of each transaction, just give me a moment here to get the data out that I need. So I'm going to get my date, I'm going to get my store, I'm going to get my receipt number, and then I'm going to grab the final charge, right? So the final charge, again, list price plus tax plus tip. So I'm going to drop that on text, and I'm going to see, okay, this first row of data, whatever this is, November 1st, store 100, receipt 1, is showing me that that person's final price was $11. So if I didn't do any fact checking, I might say, yeah, okay, I mean, I guess this makes sense, this works, move on with my day. But I am a naturally skeptical person when it comes to data because it always does things you don't expect. So I'm going to select that data point and view the underlying data and then hit the full data. And what I'm going to see is this is actually two separate rows of data. So it's showing a final price of $11 because it's $5.50 summed together twice. So to quickly just solve this issue, I could just change the aggregation here for final charge. I could just change it to average or minimum, I suppose. Or I could do a level of detail expression. But I think actually when I first worked on this project, it was pretty level of detail expression. So there was even more issues coming up. Anyways, as you can see, like there are different, I guess, workarounds that you have to utilize when you have data that's duplicating like this. Relationships makes this whole experience cleaner. So let me go ahead and just take the same data that we were just talking about, but just do this as a relationship instead. So we have our order headers, and then I want to relationship, or I don't know what the verb is yet. We're going to just call the verb relationship. We're going to relationship to order details. So same thing, I need to establish that relationship on the three different fields. So receipt ID is one of those, store number is another, and then date is the third component. All right, so I've established this relationship. So I'm going to essentially just do that exact same thing that I just did. So I'll grab the date field, store field, the receipt field. And this is what's so interesting. I'm going to grab that final charge field now and drop that on text. And you'll notice that Tableau figured it out. It's like, oh, yeah, the final charge there is $5.50. So Tableau is automatically aggregating the data at the level that you are displaying on your screen. So you don't have to do a fixed level of detail expression to say, well, fix on the date and the store and the receipt and give me the minimum value. Tableau essentially does that already with relationships. So in some ways, I think relationships, while there's new content to learn, it's actually a fair amount of unlearning as well. Because I know I've been so conditioned to expect Tableau to have certain kinds of behaviors, like I need to write a level of detail expression, where sometimes that's not going to be necessary anymore. All right, so there's sort of our first walkthrough example. And again, if you have questions on these things, feel free to write them down, or you can send them in the questions dialogue. I'll probably be addressing most of them at the end, just because 30 minutes is a quick turnaround for a lot of content. But that's example one. So example number two would be filtering across multiple data sources easily. So in this case, similar restaurant information, a little bit different though. I'm going to look at, well, what happens if we're trying to manage a restaurant and look at how are hours performing as compared to expectation, and how are sales performing as compared to expectation. So sales and hours, they're different measures, right? It's not like you can just join the data together. It's not like, oh, well, let me take the cook and join that to the cook's sales. Like what? There's different levels of granularity, so it doesn't really work that way. So traditionally for something like this, you maybe would keep these tables separate, or maybe you would try and kind of create one of those massive flat tables for Tableau where you're unioning a bunch of different tables together. And that's still a valid approach. But in this case, so let's say I've got my restaurant hours data source. I'm just going to keep this really simple. Apologies if these visuals aren't going to be so beautiful, but that's not the point of this webinar. All right, so here's how many hours each job worked in each period at each store. And then let's see how that compared to what they were scheduled to work. Again, I apologize for ugly visuals. I'd love to create bar and bar charts and all that, but I'm afraid we'd run out of time if that was the case. Okay, so there's your actual hours versus scheduled hours. So sometimes, okay, these cooks here work more hours than they were scheduled for. In this period, though, the cooks worked less hours than they were scheduled for. Now I'm going to essentially do that same thing, but for sales. So I'll get my store and my period and look at our sales and compare that to what our forecasted sales were. Okay, so let me go ahead and flip measure names over to color. So similar kind of deal. Just give me a moment here to pick some colors for us. All right, so similar kind of deal. Sometimes sales were higher than expected, sometimes lower. So these are two different data sources. I just use restaurant hours and restaurant sales. And then now I want to combine them together into a single dashboard. I think I've queued up a dashboard for myself already. Cool. Got to find what those sheets are called now. Here they are. There's hours and there's sales. So now let's say I just really want to zero in on one specific store. Like how is store 104 doing altogether? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a filter based on store number and name. And I'm just going to go ahead and just pick store 104. And I'm just going to pause for a moment because it seems like there was a couple folks that were saying they weren't seeing the screen catching up with what I was saying. Does somebody mind us, or maybe Kirk, you're kind of monitoring this. Can you just chime in quickly if you're seeing my screen moving along with what I'm saying?
Yeah, Eric, it was just hung up for a second. It looks like it's caught up, at least on my side it is.
Okay, awesome, thank you. So we've got store 104 filtered down to for restaurant sales, but unfortunately this restaurant hours worksheet here on the left it's a different data source. So I can't just easily say, well, apply to worksheets and all using this data source. So in the past, this is where you'd say, yeah, well, okay, just filter this to all worksheets using related data sources. And actually, that would solve our problem. This is, I guess you couldn't really see it visually because there's a lot of periods on this left side, but this did filter this down to just store 104. Or let me change that to another store, 105. It filtered it down to 105. So Tableau is actually using a bit of its blending technology in the background to allow for that to happen. So notice that like restaurant sales, you can see this little filter here, little filter icon with one cylinder pointing to another, indicating it's a cross data source filter. I go to this worksheet and you can see I've got the blue check mark, the orange check mark. That is just a visual indication that some form of blending is happening. So that's okay, that's not the end of the world, but it can lead to some unintended consequences. Like maybe you make another worksheet that's unrelated to that dashboard that's using one of these data sources and you don't notice it, but it auto-filtered it down to store 105 because you told Tableau filter all related data sources. There's some manual ways of getting around this, but it takes a fair amount of effort. So something that could potentially make this a lot easier would be, you guessed it, using relationships. So I'm going to do the same thing we did now, but use a relationship instead. So I'll get hours. Oh, hours is already out there. I'm going to get sales. And I think I need to establish a relationship using a couple of fields. Store would be one of those relationships the tables have. And another would be period, I believe. Okay. So now what I could do is build the same visuals out that I just did. And I'm just going to do this really quickly this time. So excuse the fast build, but you already saw me build something similar. And now I just need to save time. All right. So there's our hours comparison. And now I want to see a sales comparison. So I'm going to do essentially the same thing, but with sales. Store number, period, sales, forecasted sales. Okay, and something that you might notice is that notice that it auto blended. So I only really want to use things from this data source here, like restaurant hours and sales using relationships. But because earlier I said that thing where I was like, oh, filter across all related data sources. It's doing this blending and auto filtering. So it's filtering it down to store 105 because of what I said earlier. I'm just going to rip this off because I don't actually want that there, but I just want to explain what that thing is doing there. And so now I'm going to build essentially the same dashboard that I built earlier, but now I've got hours here and sales there. I'm going to add a filter again for store number. Let's see, there we go. And then let me go ahead and just filter this down to maybe just store, let's see, 106. And I'm going to make sure this is applied to that other worksheet, restaurant hours. And Tableau thinks of it as the same data source because all we did was just establish a relationship between the two tables. So this makes it way cleaner because I don't have to say filter across all these other data sources and hope that I never use something that might get conflicted with the filter. So this could potentially make filtering across multiple data sources a much cleaner and just easier experience. All right. So one last example for us, and then probably we'll be at the half-hour point, but I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes to take any questions that came up because I know it's fast and it's a lot of new content. So the third thing would be only duplicating, or I guess I should say, adding out additional columns or dimensions when necessary. So I want to start by walking you through a situation that I encountered a few years back working with somebody. They'd been using Tableau for a while, had a lot of good experiences, but had reached out because their data source was much slower than expected. Like to the point where they would change one filter in a dashboard and it would take like 60 seconds to update. And they were kind of left scratching their head because they were like, well, we turned it into a data extract and it's only 15,000 rows and it's running on a server. So we know there's a lot of memory. So what's going on here? So I did some investigation and found out that I use the Tableau data extracts and the hide all unused columns feature. And I found out they were using custom SQL and Tableau to join about 25 tables from Salesforce. Each of those tables was about 50 columns, and so their total column count was 1,400. Now, it turns out they only needed about 30 of those columns for their analysis, but they had way more than they needed. So what we did, like I mentioned, was use the extract feature to hide all of the unused fields. So just in case you're like, what are you talking about? You can right-click on a data source, create a Tableau data extract, and tell Tableau to hide all fields that aren't being used. That can be a little bit problematic because if you hide a field that's not currently in a worksheet somewhere, but then realize like later on that you actually do want that field, now you have to go back to a live connection, show hidden fields, unhide what you want. So hide all unused fields is great as long as you're pretty much done with your data source and maybe don't need anything new. But it's not necessarily that great for kind of ongoing development. And the other option would be, okay, you could go to your data source and just right click and manually hide columns you don't need. But of course, when we're talking about a scale of 1,400 columns, that's a bit absurd. So, and again, this feature didn't exist yet, and we just used hide all unused fields and just kind of dealt with some of the headaches. But in these days, I would use Tableau Relationships. So let's say you're looking at some sales information and you just join to a customer table. Or combine, I guess I should say, to a customer table. And that customer table has a whole bunch of information, but you really only care about one or two of the columns there. So rather than having to go and hide the columns you don't want, what I could do, okay, which states have the most sales? Let me go into doing this with relationships. So I've got my sales, and this is a very small data source, so you're not actually, this is 500 rows for sales, so you're not actually going to see the performance difference here, but you can just trust me. This is just an example. So I'm going to say, okay, yeah, the join is on customer ID. And so here's my customer detailed table. And now I could just grab the one field I want from customer detail, right? Which is which states have the most sales. So what I want to do is grab my state field, drop that on rows. And then I'm going to grab my sales amount field, drop that on columns. Do a sort, and I could find out, okay, California had the most sales at 18,000. So all that Tableau has done for the sake of this join is multiplied state out 500 times. And if you're like, why are you saying 500? What does 500 have to do with anything? It just has to do with the size of these tables that I'm using here. So sales is 500 rows. Whereas customer detail is 100 rows. So normally what would happen is in a join, Tableau would take all these different columns, like let's say there's 20 columns here. It would take all 20 of them and multiply them out 500 times for that join, because we'd have the result table that would have all of the dimensions duplicated out. But because relationships are so flexible and they're only really including fields into, I'm going to put this in air quotes, a join clause when you need them, it's multiplied state out to match the 500 rows, but it hasn't done that necessarily with gender or job title or street name. So it's more flexible and could save you from having to hide fields that you don't want for performance reasons. All right, so let's go back to the beginning. So we've looked at those three examples: reducing measure duplication, allowing easier multiple data source filtering, and keeping you from unnecessary duplication of dimensions that you don't necessarily need. I know that was fast paced. Like I said, this is being recorded, so it's something you can come back to. And there were portions where I built things where the focus was really more about relationships than the actual visual. So if you care more about those visuals, feel free just to send me a message and we can spend some more time looking at that. But thanks for being here. I know that's a kind of a quick overview, but hopefully that at least jogged a few ideas for you about situations in which these might be helpful. And maybe there was something there you recognized and said, yeah, maybe that is something where I could use this. So I know we're at the half-hour mark and some of you need to drop, but I'm going to stick around for a few minutes to answer questions. And I've seen a few of them come through. So thank you for sending those to me. For those of you that did, for those that have to drop right now, thanks so much for being here. And like I said, I'll have this content out to you soon. So I'm going to flip back through the questions, try and catch as many as I can. And while I'm doing that, if you have questions, feel free to shoot them over. But right before I do that, while those questions come in, you might be wondering, like, what do I do with this now? Or how would I ever use this thing? So a few things. First of all, if you're watching the recording of this because you couldn't make it in person, no sweat. Feel free just to email me the questions directly at eric.parker@onenumber.biz. My recommendations would be practice. We'll be doing blog posts about all kinds of Tableau topics, including relationships. We've got some classes coming up over the next couple months. And I've got those listed down below. And I will be sending out a link to where you can find some more information about those classes, the days and the cost and what's included and all of that. And we really have something for everybody, whether you just started using Tableau 2 months ago or whether you think you know everything. There's some classes I think that will stretch you regardless. So I'm going to take the time now to go through those questions and yeah, we'll see what you come up with. So one question I'm seeing right now is this functionality new to 2020? And yes, I think I didn't mention that at the beginning, but this feature just came out with Tableau Desktop 2020.2, which I think is just about a month ago is when that came out. So this is brand new. So if you haven't updated there yet, you probably haven't seen this, but now you know it's coming and you'll be ahead of the curve. I don't know this for sure, but I think that this is probably going to be the biggest feature release that Tableau will come out with this year for the Tableau Desktop series, just because it is such a foundational change to the way that this all works. Another question I got was, do I recommend using this instead of joins from now on? That's a good question. Because I'm a creature of habit, I will probably still use joins a fair amount, but I think that Tableau's guidance long-term is going to be to try to get people to use relationships more and more. There are situations where you need a join based on, the complexity of the data tables or the way the relationships are set up. Maybe just doing this relationship feature wouldn't necessarily work for all circumstances. Yeah, I see a comment, this maybe more so replaces blends than joins. I think that's probably true. I don't know if it has restrictions to certain kinds of data sources like blends do, but you can see, like, when we were filtering across multiple data sources, instead of having to use blending to do that, now you can use relationships, which in my opinion is a much cleaner experience. So hold up, I know there's a lot more questions. So one of them was about using level of detail expressions. So level of detail expressions are not going to be phased out. They'll still be around, still totally valid. There's going to be great use cases for them. And a level of detail expression, like that restaurant example I showed you where it showed $11, but really the final price was $5.50. The level of detail expression would still work. It's just, it might not be as necessary anymore based on the behavior and the results that relationships give you. And yeah, so that's our question. So we can use relationships always instead of different types of joins? Not necessarily. This is probably getting a little bit complex, but I can think of some very specific circumstances where I would need a join. So an example of that would be like relationships just lets you say that, like, oh, this field has a relationship to that field, right? Oh, these are related based on store number. And that's fine, but joins give you the capability to say, this field is equal to that, or join where this field is greater than that, or less than that, or does not equal that. So I can think of different things like data scaffolding or cross joins where a relationship, at least at this point, is not going to be able to replicate that functionality. Maybe that's in the long-term plans, I don't know, but at least at this point, there's still going to be some good use cases where you want to use joins. Let's see. Yeah, so I got some questions about Tableau Online and Tableau Server and how does this work with those. My assumption is that in order for relationships to be able to perform on Tableau Server, it's going to need to be Tableau Server 2020.2 or later. I don't think they back versioned it for this new desktop feature to work with an old version of server. I suppose there's a very small chance that could be the case, but I think that, 99% sure that you could bet on the fact that you'll need desktop 2020.2 and server 2020.2 in order for this functionality to be able to work. Another question was, how do you know if you're using a relationship or a join necessarily? So the main thing is you're going to see, if you just see like the noodle, as they call it, then you know it's a relationship. When you use a join, it's going to be that situation where you select a table, open it, and you're still going to see that, same old familiar Venn diagram where it's like, oh, this is connected to that. Here's the join Venn diagram where I can select things. So all that functionality is still there, and that's what you're going to notice. But yeah, just so you know, the default behavior now when you drag two separate tables out, unless you do that specific open selection that I just showed you, is it is going to take you down the relationships path rather than the join path. All right. Get caught up with all the questions here. Maybe I'll just do two more than anything else. Feel free just to shoot me a message. Yeah, thanks for all the comments. Missing a lot of you folks too. And yeah, looking forward to getting together. I got a question about getting auto-registered to upcoming events. I don't know about a way to do that, but I'll continue to send out links to Eventbrite so that you can continue to stay up to date when we do webinars and classes and things like that. Oh, there's a question about, do relationships work across all data sources, or are there some that cannot be related? That's a great question. My immediate guess is it has the similar restrictions to blending. Yeah, so you'll notice like Tableau server and JSON files, to name a couple, are not available in relationships. Actually, I said blending, I meant cross database joins. So whatever technical restrictions that you had with cross database joins, so again, like JSON files or a couple others. Well, anyways, Tableau server data sources are probably also not going to work in relationships. I do know that Tableau's development team is working to try and make as many of those available as possible, because that's obviously kind of limiting when you have data sources you can't combine together. So something to keep an eye on in the future. Hopefully they'll continue to make progress there. And another question, can you relate an Excel file and a published Tableau data source? I guess that just sort of answered that. Yeah, if it's a published Tableau data source, then probably not. I've seen people kind of come up with workarounds for that. Maybe they download that published Tableau data source, or they get to the data before it's published and maybe, do a join or a relationship there. So depending on your level of access, there might be some workarounds. But unfortunately, yeah, just using the straight up relationships feature with those two is not going to work. Awesome. Okay, so last thing here, as we sort of, I guess, close out, would be, yeah, thanks so much for joining. Here's my email address again on the screen for anybody that might be following up and watching the recording, and I'll get this out to you shortly. So thanks again for being here. I got a couple of questions at the end there that I will just email you directly with answers to those. So thanks so much, everybody. Really appreciate it, and I look forward to talking to you soon.